Hey, hello and welcome everyone. This is the last seminar of the second term of the academic year, and we're delighted to welcome Caroline Goodson for what looks to be a very exciting paper. However, I do need to do a few tiny little quick bits of housekeeping before we start with the good stuff. First, a few quick words about the mailing list, which following our recent survey, we now know from those who completed the survey exactly who wants to stay on the mailing list and who doesn't. And we needed to know that to be in line with data protection regulation and so on. Our mailing list was totally unwieldy and about 10 years old, and it was time for a cleanup. So we have done that. And we thank everyone who helped us with that. But we are very sure that it seems a bit harsh, and there might be people who have dropped off now and want to be on. So just to say, you can come back on, of course, if you write to us at our email address and say explicitly that you would like us to have your email address. And that's gardenhistory.ihr@gmail.com. And a quick, exciting announcement about our publication, Conversations in Garden History, which some of you will have seen and know in its hard, well, it's soft cover, but in its hard version. We will have a digital version available from this weekend. So please check Amazon and have a look. It might be that you prefer digital books and copies, and it may be for you. So that's the housekeeping, short and sweet. And now I'd like to welcome Caroline again. Caroline is professor of early medieval history at King's College, Cambridge. And she became interested in urban cultivation about 12 years ago when she was living, I may be slightly off that number, but some time ago, 12 years ago-ish, when she was living in the Bay Area in California, where an urban gardening movement of sorts was taking shape. And those of us who have been coming to seminars, and some of you who have looked at our publication will know that urban gardening has been a sort of a continuing thread every year. Despite whatever theme we do, it does tend to pop up. Michael Ann Mullen's paper on urban gardening in Detroit, Michigan, Jesse O'Neill's on Singapore, and more. So this is really nice to go back in time with Caroline to a much earlier period, but it was quite exciting to hear that something quite contemporary piqued her interest. She was working on documents in southern Italy and is now focusing on the period between 500 and 1100, whatever we call it now, AD. And her research concentrates on the nature of power in the early medieval world in the Western Mediterranean and in particular in Italy. She takes an interdisciplinary approach, moving between history and archaeology, and she studies how different groups positioned themselves as successors to the Romans' past glories or as innovators in a new world order. She has published extensively, her most recent work being Cultivating the City in Early Medieval England, on which this paper will draw. So we are very lucky to have Caroline taking us back in time on a sort of magical mystery tour. Thank you for joining us, Caroline.
Thank you very much, Christine. And thank you to Pippa and to Scheherazade for the organization and coordination this evening. I am wanting to speak to you, as Christine said, about gardens in the cities and gardens in the minds of people in early medieval Italy. The urban landscapes of Italian cities changed very dramatically in the early Middle Ages with respect to what they had been in antiquity. And even if you're not a medievalist, you will say, well, obviously, we all know about the fall of Rome. We all know about the Dark Ages. Of course, there was radical transformation. And that's correct. Life all over the Mediterranean changed really significantly. And quite a lot of work has been done recently to try and quantify and establish the dates and the reasons for all of those changes, as well as to think about how people who lived through them understood them at the time. And so once it was sufficient to say, oh, well, barbarians invaded, the Western Roman Empire fell, Christianity became dominant, that brought about a fragmentation of political structures, low literacy, and power concentrated in religious institutions until we get to the commercial revolution of the 11th century, and then everything picks back up again. But we've been working, we historians have been working for about the past 20 years to think more about how to understand what actually meant by the fall of Rome, what we mean, what it looked like on the ground, and at what scale we ought to think about massive political transformations and how it was experienced. And so my work on gardens contributes to that wider discussion. I've been working on horticulture and food growing gardens, as Christine said, looking first at the documents and then moving into archaeobotany. I do tend to work between history and archaeology. And the analysis of gardens permits me to consider the material and the textual evidence and put it into dialogue. And that's valuable because there's gaps in the archaeological record and there's gaps in the textual record that they don't fit perfectly together, but they allow us, if we look at them together, we can see a sort of broader picture. And we can look at the intersections of economy, of politics, and of ideas. You, as garden historians, will know that all of those things intersect, but this is something that's relatively new for people who are studying the early Middle Ages. So let me give you an example of the kind of thing that I'm working on. There we go. This is one of the documents that I work on. This is a typical document of the early medieval period in Italy. This is from the 8th century in Lucca, which is Tuscany. From Lucca, from the 8th century, we have dozens of documents, original Latin documents preserved on parchment like this. So we can actually say this is typical. In the format of this document, it begins with the names of the Lombard rulers. I don't know how quickly you can read this handwriting or the Latin of it, but it's got a fairly formulaic structure, which gives the dates according to the reigns of the Lombard rulers. It describes possession of properties according to pretty conventional Roman standards of ownership. And it gives the location for the property in question by defining the boundaries with neighboring properties. And then it records the selling of the property for a price. So I've just excerpted the kind of juicy bits in the middle. Aripert the cleric, who's the son of Autus, declares that he has sold and transferred to Jordanus, the venerable man, a priest, his house, which he is known to have or is seen to have inside the city, with its lot, with its garden and its well, located next to San Giorgio. On one side, the one property boundary is Raduel the notary with a hedge. On the far end is the lot of Bertionis Belongonis, and on the other side is Memoranius's garden. A house with a lot, land, garden, and well, and an or work kind of together in Latin at this period, and everything which is seen in them. Wholly, to me, no authority is retained. So these are conventional norms that anybody who is looking at Roman property documents would recognize something about the structure, and indeed later medieval documents as well. And we can recognize this as an alienation of property, right? He's selling and he's not retaining any rights to it. The garden in question is an urban property, as the document makes really, really clear. I'm giving you an image here that shows you these are some of the other documents from Lucca. This is how they were stored in the diocesan archive. And this is a map of what we know about Lucca. These are the Roman walls here. These are later medieval settlements and walls. And there's the Church of San Giorgio. And so this is the little neighborhood where this house and this garden was located. So Aripert's neighborhood is very typical of cities in early medieval Italy in that it's a mix of open plots, of gardens, of hedges, and of houses owned by different individuals. Now, this urban landscape conditions And it's conditioned by certain forms of economic exchange, certain power structures, relationships between laity and priesthood. These are specific to this period in the Middle Ages. And I want to interrogate how these gardens work in an urban context in their own terms. But it's probably useful to start by thinking about how different this is with respect to what Lucca would have been like 700 or 600 years earlier, what most Roman cities were like. So in the Roman cities of Italy, there were very few gardens. I'm showing you here a GIS of Pompeii. You can see that it's got mostly paved areas. This is a modern park area, not an ancient one. And I'm showing you here a detail of a house. This is the house of the Vestals, in which there are very, very limited areas which are designated by the archaeologists as formal gardens. A very small atrium here and a little bit around an open a hypostyle court or atrium there. Now, the gardens that were in these kinds of houses in Pompeii and the gardens that were in Roman cities of Italy were decorative, fundamentally decorative. They were ornamental. We know a fair amount about what was planted in them from excavations. So they had evergreen hedges and trees, so box, cypress, myrtles. And they had flowering plants like violets and roses or forced lilies and gladiolas. Roman gardens, whether they were in townhouses or suburban villas or urban porticos as decorations within the city, they were mostly green. That is, they were mostly planted with trees and shrubs. They were bounded by fences, walls, basins, and they were animated by mosaics and sculptures and sometimes exotic animals and birds. The term viridarium, green space, was used in antiquity to refer to pleasure gardens. So areas of greenery that were enclosed by architecture, either walls or portico. They may have had flowers, shrubs, trees, sometimes topiary. And when we have descriptions of them, they tend to be in very high status houses and prestigious places. So if I can stay in Pompeii, I can show you what some archaeology can tell us about what these places are. So one insula in Pompeii, that's sort of one city block within the Roman city of Pompeii, has been excavated stratigraphically using very modern single context excavation techniques, with a very clear attention to sifting for archaeobotanical remains, which are not necessarily obvious to the naked eye. You really need to mechanically sift for them in order to recover them. And this research from Regio 6 Insula 1 gives us some really detailed information with very clear chronological phases about the flora of Pompeii in its domestic context. The plant remains from the entire insula of Regio 6 Insula 1 makes clear that there were food plants, including wheat, olives, grapes, and nuts, which are mostly fruits and grains and the drupes of olives that are brought to townhouses already processed, right? It's not that the wheat was grown in this garden by any stretch of the imagination. It's that the food stuff was processed elsewhere and brought in. There were also flowers. So in this particular insula, the seeds from flowers are purple gromwell, opium poppies, forget-me-nots, the ones that are there on the side of the screen, pimpernels, anagallis, and viper's bugloss. Some of these might have been grown for medicinal purposes. We shouldn't assume that they were all there as decoration, and they are very commonly grown annuals. These are not bushes or shrubs. So domestic gardens may have grown both decorative and edible plants, but they were by no means the principal place for the growing and cultivation of foodstuffs for urban dwellers. They were backdrops to prestigious architecture. They were aesthetically pleasing, we can imagine. They were fragrant. They were perhaps healthful places to be, but they were not kitchen gardens. This is also true if we leave Pompeii. If we go to, say, Ostia, here I'm showing you an artist's reconstruction of an insula that is a tenement building in Ostia that's known as it's known by number names, Casa dei Dipinti, but also the House of the Gardens, because there were excavated fountains and gardens in the center. But I think you can see that these are distinctly pleasure gardens for the occupants of the tenement, not food gardens. This is true because Roman cities in Italy and Roman cities across the Roman Empire had a very complex system of food cultivation and transport. So food cultivation was rural. It was symbolically aligned with core and essential values about tradition and proper social order. That is, in villages, in the countryside, that's where food cultivation happens. Cities, by contrast, were places of civilization, of culture, of order and educated leisure, as well as commercial exchange of lots of things, but of food as well. So I'm showing you here, this is a part of a tombstone of a food vendor from Ostia, the same city that we just looked at, one of the port cities of the port city of Rome, in which she's got baskets with different kinds of foodstuff. She's got bread, she's got sausages, and she's selling them in a kind of temporary stall. In a forum, something that she can pack up and put away at the end of the day. Now, in some cities in Rome and Italy, there were ornamental gardens. So I'm showing you here an artist's reconstruction of the Forum of Peace. Now, this was a very specific kind of pleasurable space that was intended for a representation of the imperial project, its expansion over enormous territories, and its cultural values for classicizing art, and the normative message about the pleasures of fountains, of classical statuary, and of decorative flowers. So we know through the excavation of this area of the Forum of Peace that the flower beds alongside the fountains were planted with Rosa gallica, an imported cultivar of pink, bright pink roses. In Rome, we also have the horti, the famous horti. Horti, as you all know, means gardens, but this is sort of a trick of a name in the Roman world, because these are definitely not places that were cultivating food. They're definitely not food gardens, which is what the word hortus principally refers to. They are, by very definition, not productive. They were outside the walls in the Republican period. So in Rome, these are the Republican walls here, and these walls here were only built in the beginning of the 3rd century. Those are Aurelian's walls here. So the earliest dark colors here are the horti of the Republican period. Up on the Pincian Hill is one of the most famous ones, the Garden of Lucullanus, the Hortus of Lucullanus. And then there are new horti, which are put in around the Aurelian walls in a slightly later period. They're on the margins of the city. They are often privately owned, and they are places for meeting and entertaining, and not for food production. So there's a structured message of the cultural value of ornamental horticulture and the distinctions between the places where people live and the kind of living that they do in cities. All of this very clearly differentiated understanding of the place of horticulture in Romans' lives ended around the 6th century. So if I take you to another artist's reconstruction of the buildings that we just looked at, the Forum of Peace. It's a little bit confusing because you have to imagine that we've switched around, and so we were looking before at the entrance to the Temple of Peace here, now we're looking at it from the back. But one of the things you'll spot right away is there are no pink roses here. There are no fountains any longer, and there are no pink roses any longer. The beds of the fountains have been filled in. The beds of the roses are gone, and these are used for very low status houses. So little kind of huts that have been built in the center of the Forum of the Peace in the period between the 5th and the 6th centuries. And this is not exclusive. This is a phenomenon that happens not just in the monumental imperial fora, but also in all kinds of architecture in Rome and across the Italian peninsula. So here I'm showing you some houses that were excavated in the 1930s when the Stazioni Termini were built, 30s and 40s. This is a place in the Piazza del Cinquecento, and it's known as the Domus under the Piazza del Cinquecento. And it's a pretty conventional Imperial Roman house, much like what we just looked at in terms of Pompeii, in that there were a couple of areas that had presumably were open to the sky and had maybe space for planting in them, but really this was not intended to have been a house with any significant kind of cultivated space within it. In the 5th or 6th century, and I'm saying 5th and 6th century a lot because our dating of material culture that comes from that period is really quite difficult. It sort of all blurs together around the 5th and 6th centuries. So it could be 420 or it could be 570, and it's very hard to know the difference between those two in some of these contexts. But in the 5th/6th centuries, this house was radically reconfigured. So the red represents the part of the house that was preserved for inhabitation. So people continued to live in this part of the house. And in fact, there's a very large latrine that comes off the street that probably became something of a public bathroom in this period. But the rest of the house the roof were taking off, the walls were partially knocked down, and it was backfilled with earth and rubble. And so I'm coloring it brown because I want you to think about this as an open space. It becomes an open space in this period, the 5th to the 6th centuries. And while here, because of the date of the excavation and because of the fact that it wasn't sieved in order to collect archaeobotanical remains, we have no idea what actually transpired in this space. We can tell from inference and from comparison with a number of other stratigraphically excavated sites that in these kinds of reconfigured late antique domus, we often find cultivated spaces. So we can point to examples in Naples, we can point to other examples in Rome, where the original footprint of the house is sort of cut in half, and half of it is given over to gardening, I think, or to open space. We know that some of these were actually used for gardens, for food-producing gardens, from textual evidence. So this is a letter from Gregory the Great, so the Pope Gregory the Great, who was the Bishop of Rome from the very end of the 6th century into the beginning of the 7th century. He dies in 604. We have a huge collection of letters from Gregory's time as bishop, which give us a really good insight into the activities of a pope of this period, partially because Gregory was very dynamic in his own right, but also because his word was used by people later on in the Middle Ages as a voice of significant authority. We have this huge collection of letters that come from Gregory. And so one of them describes, his job to deal with the property problem in Rome. And this letter gives us a sense of what he's doing. So I've excerpted a bit here. For those choosing a religious vocation, we should take care, with suitable consideration, that the occurrence of some hardship neither makes them inactive nor undermines the strength, heaven forbid, of their holy way of life. And for that reason, we order, with the present authority, that you should hand over the following property to the abbess Flora, with the right of possession for her indubitable ownership. The house is located in this city in the 4th region, next to a place called the White Hens, the property of the Holy Church of Rome, over which we preside with God's authority, and in which a patrician lady, Campana, is known to have once lived. Handed over with the garden also and the lodgings, which a doorway encloses within the same house. Thus, with Christ's help, the abbess can construct a convent in this house, where she can live with her community so that she, and also her successors, in status and position, can possess the above-mentioned house and garden and all things belonging to them, as we have said, with a peaceful and inalienable right, as granted by us, due to our respect for her piety. So there's a lot in this letter, right? The patrician lady, who knows what happened to her? Why did she give her property, her house to the church? She does. She's not the only person who does this. Gregory finds himself with a lot of property on his hands across Italy and Sicily and North Africa, but definitely in the city of Rome. And here what he's doing is he's giving this house that has a garden and has a little room of lodgings as well, and he's giving them to a religious community of nuns so that they can live in this space and concentrate on what they're supposed to be doing, which is being nuns. So this is not the only example. We have other houses with gardens that are dedicated to religious communities by Gregory. We've got 3 letters in which he does exactly the same kind of thing. But it gives us a sort of glimpse of how the papacy, or how the Bishop of Rome is handling this issue of these kinds of houses, and the extent to which the context of that domus under the Piazza di Cinquecento that I just showed you relates to a real change in the way that housing in Roman cities worked. Now, this idea of what religious communities are supposed to do for their foodstuffs is going to come back to it, and we will hear from Gregory again. But it's useful to think about how new religious forms of living and new religious households created new needs. And this pushes us to think a little bit more about how household economies worked in this period. I've described for you a change in the way the cities and horticulture within them worked. And it's worth asking, so what? Why does this matter? Well, this matters because there's been a fairly vibrant debate among archaeologists and historians of the early Middle Ages in the 90s until relatively recently about the nature of urbanism, the nature of cities, and specifically the nature of Italian cities in the early Middle Ages. Whether the ways in which people used cities constituted a catastrophic rupture with ancient past or continuity with antiquity. And urban horticulture and those kinds of spaces like the Domus de Cinquecento that had open, unplanted, unbuilt areas, and the places that archaeologists where archaeologists have identified dark earth. This is one line of argumentation in the debate. So those who consider the transformation to be catastrophic and to have a very pessimistic view tend to view the arrival of gardens in those prestigious Roman cities as a descent into rurality and at an end of the great civilizing towns and cities of Roman Italy. That was a sort of barometer of just how far things have gone from antiquity. And part of that has to do with our own modern perceptions of how urban gardening works. And it's quite interesting in this chart that I'm showing you from an article by Brian Ward Perkins on this very matter, that there's a distinction between medievalists who take a position on, medievalists who tend to work on texts, who take a certain position of optimism and continuity, and archaeologists who work on archaeology, and specifically archaeologists who work on Roman period archaeology, like Andrea Carandini, who's the far end of the pessimism side of this continuum. They have really radically opposed views of the same evidence. Now, many of us in this country, in Britain, have a particular image in mind when they're thinking about urban gardening in a period of radical transformation. So I'm showing you here an image of Kensington Palace, which had garden allotments in the First World War. And I'm showing you here some things that you will be undoubtedly familiar with about the Dig for Victory campaign of World War II in Britain. And I think it's worthwhile thinking about whether this is the best way to understand Auerpert's house in Lucca, or that Domus de Cinquecento, in the Piazza di Cinquecento in Rome, or the houses in Gregory's letter. Is it that the breakdown of long-distance trade in the context of war, of the Lombard invasions of Italy, for instance, means that everyone has to grow their own food? And I think many people have, without real consideration of the evidence, said, yes, definitely, that's exactly what it is. It's sort of economic and political needs prompt this sort of reuse of space that was otherwise leisure and pleasurable space and converting it into cultivated space. But what happens when we examine both the wartime allotment movement, as some modern historians and modern geographers do, and I'll point to Franklin Ginn, who's a geographer at Bristol, who's done, I think, really good work on the Dig for Victory campaign. And what people who are looking at the early medieval rise in domestic horticulture, like me, have done, is that we have to start asking questions about who is responsible, who had access to these spaces, who controlled what was grown and what else came with it, what shaped the kinds of places in which this kind of activity took place, and was farming in the city fundamentally different from farming in the countryside, which remained the predominant agricultural system in the 20th century in Britain and also in early medieval Italy. What relationship did this practice have with strategies of power, or systems of belief, or economic networks within the early Middle Ages? So I want to argue that horticulture is not a neutral activity. I'm showing you here some boys taking over a damaged bomb site. Horticulture is not a neutral activity. Even when you put a pot of basil on your windowsill, it is an economic and cultural action to sidestep the market, to improve upon the availability of fresh cut or dried offering of herbs. It's rooted in cultural values of home cooking, of fresh cut herbs and the pleasures that they bring. And relatedly, we need to contextualize our understanding of medieval cities in order to acknowledge that unbuilt parts of the city were as critical to the workings of power and status as the buildings were. So we're generally, as medievalists, really quite happy to believe that a very large chapel is an expression of power and authority by an abbot or by an individual or a king. I'm at King's College, and we've got this huge, great chapel around the corner, and there's no way you can mistake it. It's definitely an expression of power and authority. And I want us to think about how gardens relate to those kinds of expressions. It's not something that we're habituated to do as medievalists. And so I want us to think about the reconfiguration of home and garden and suggest that it's not simply a matter of wartime necessity and straitened circumstances and making do, but it's an entirely new set of cultural values and power relationships. So several things happened to bring about gardening in cities where it had not been before and where it became normal to have a house with a plot for gardening. And I've got a blank screen on this here to just sort of run through very quickly, what are some of these changes? Well, elites moved out of their residences in Italy. From the time of Constantine, it was no longer necessary for senators to keep a townhouse at Rome. And Alaric's sack of Rome in 410 and sack of the whole countryside of central Italy made sure it was not really desirable to keep an expensive townhouse up in Rome when the emperor's in the east. So this drained money and resources away from Rome, as well as many other Italian centers. And it's worth remembering that the sack of Rome was one episode in a very long period of war and conflict through the 5th century, which threatened and at times destroyed the carefully built estates and the luxurious residential buildings and the hectares and hectares and hectares of fields and orchards and grapevines and vegetable gardens of Italy. The wars, the elite relocation, all of this meant that Italy's agricultural system wobbled. Market gardening was no longer lucrative. There were fewer people in cities to buy things. Your fields might get burned. The empire was no longer subsidizing the transport of your goods in quite the same way it had been previously. The wider changes to the empire affected long-distance movement of goods as well. And so after the Vandal conquest, pottery and grain and olive oil still came from North Africa to Italy, but in much diminished quantities. And after the Arab conquest of North Africa, even less. Cultivated flowers which had been central to temple worship in antiquity. The temples were lined with gardens. People wore crowns of flowers and leaves. These were no longer desirable once Christian fathers had their say. So the entire garland industry collapsed. Cities in Italy were increasingly small in scale. Depopulation happened because of migration, because of disease, because of hunger, combination of all of these things, leaving large areas of dense cities uninhabited. When we look really closely at this dehabitation, or what Richard Krauthammer, who was a great scholar of Rome in particular and of the Middle Ages, he called it the dishabitato, the uninhabited parts of cities. We see that it wasn't that the whole of Knightsbridge or Primrose Hill was empty, but rather that within individual plots of townhouses or insulae of tenement buildings, they were scaled down and parts of them were partially destroyed and dismantled or backfilled, while parts of them were preserved to leave smaller residences. And what we saw in the Piazza di Cinquecento in Rome can be multiplied across the peninsula in Italy, in Milan, in Brescia, in Naples, in Palermo, etc. So this is a picture, if we fast forward 300, almost 400 years from the letter of Gregory the Great, this is the picture of Rome in the 10th century. This is another property document, in this case, a rental contract between a monastery and some renters who describe, I've cut to the juicy bits, who describe a property. It is the item that's being rented. It is one two-storied house with roof tiles, the whole thing with lower and upper floor up to its roof, with a small courtyard, a pergola, a marble staircase in front of it. It sounds quite nice, with its garden behind it, in which there are olive trees or other fruiting trees, with entrance and exit, and with all that pertains to it. It's located in Rome, in Reggio 4, not far from the Colosseum, in the temple which is called the Romuleum, which is the temple of Venus in Roma. Between the boundaries, from one side, the house of Romanus, who's a smith, the house of Franco and Sergio, who are brothers, and the garden of the heirs of Calipetras. On the second side, the garden of Constantinus, the priest, and his associates, and on the third side, the garden of Anna, most noble girl, and the house of Stephen, a bronze worker. And on the fourth side is a public road. So here is an aerial view of the center of Rome now. This is the Roman Forum. You can see the sort of paved area of the Forum here. And this is the temple of Venus and Roma. You can see the there's two temples that come back to back here. And this is the church of Santa Maria Nova, which is the church that's leasing out this house, which must be located somewhere in this this raised platform of the ancient temple. We get a sense that this garden here is attached to a house, that there's a community that's related to this church, to a group of artisans, of tradesmen, a smith and a bronze worker, and houses and gardens that are clustered together. Now, what did they grow? That's a really, really good question and a really difficult thing to answer. In the Forum of Caesar, so one of the other so-called imperial fora, we have a context of cultivation that was excavated very, very carefully and stratigraphically with sieving from the 9th century. And so we have a pretty good sense of what was cultivated there because of the seeds. We know that the stone pavement of the Forum of Caesar was removed in the late 8th century, and small trenches were cut into the earth that sat underneath the pavement. And these were planted with cabbages, with lettuces, with white mustard, with mint. You can see them on the right-hand side as the early 9th century phase. It's worth sort of thinking for a moment about how difficult it is to find seeds of annuals when you're excavating, because it implies that in order to find them, you have to let the plant go to seed. And if you're a gardener, you don't tend to let your annuals go to seed. You tend to harvest them and stop them going to seed, and then you get rid of them. In this form of Caesar, we know that they brought in a new layer of earth. So they raised the garden level in the mid-9th century for a new area of planting, which included trenches for grapevines, and then plots for fruit trees, which were cherries, yellow plums, hazelnuts, and especially fig trees. Now, among the grapevines, there were probably also kitchen vegetables. So they found coriander seeds, and it's not difficult to imagine other greens, but we wouldn't find them necessarily. The excavators hypothesized about the size of production that was available in these mixed fields, noting that it was larger than most of what appears in the documentary record. So the area that was excavated measured about 1,000 square meters, and if the cultivated area included the entire area of the former Forum of Caesar, that would have been about 2,000, 2,500 square meters, about 1,000 of which was vine and the rest was orchard. So the footprint of King's College Chapel, which is around the corner from me, which I sort of use as a marker, that's about 2,000 square meters. So that should give you a sense of scale. That's not a minor garden. It's a pretty substantial piece of terrain to work. There's a lot of different species that are cultivated here. This is not market scale production of a single specialist crop to sell on. The scale is really never very large in any of these gardens. This is the biggest one that we know about from any city in early medieval Italy. The excavators hypothesized that the vineyard part of the Forum of Caesar would have produced about 200 to 250 liters of wine a year. So that we should really think about as sufficient for a large household, more or less. It's not sufficient for a church and all of its dependents, or it's certainly not sufficient for King's College by any stretch of the imagination. So this is a family or a household plot rather than one that's destined for commercial activity. And this system reflects a fairly high status configuration. And this whole system of independent households, large or medium scale gardening, ends in about the 11th century. So even if we follow the story through in the Forum of Caesar, here's an artist's reconstruction that shows us a later phase in that same configuration, where at the beginning of the 10th century and into the 11th century, we get a neighborhood that's laid out with at least 5 little houses of a fairly modest scale and quality, lining a new road with little individual plots next to them. So what's happened here is that somebody who owned a relatively large area and brought it all under cultivation is selling it off or is renting it out to a number of different smaller tenants. Now, what are the economic and social implications of townhouses with gardens in early medieval cities? I want to think a little bit now about households and ideas about agriculture and how they changed in our period. So I'll show you something that most gardeners know and love, and that, if I can get it to work, is the underground triclinium from the Villa of Livia in Prima Porta, which is a 1st century painted underground, as I say, dining room that is painted with orchards and blossoms and fruit trees in particular. Now, in Roman society, significant cultural esteem is assigned to growing things well, despite or perhaps because of the fact that many wealthy Romans never touched a garden tool. There was a full array of positive values attached to agrarian pursuits, and in particular, the efficient and profitable farming of land. Being able to produce useful crops as well as ornamental plants was a source of pleasure, of wealth, and of ethical virtue. And from poetry to prosaic agronomic texts, we get a sense from Roman authors that there's an appreciation for working the land and not just for the ornamental value. Thinking and writing about gardening fed into the myth of the peasant patriarch, which is an ideal of Rome's traditional leaders who were men who worked their own land. And texts about agriculture celebrate the religious duties and the ethics of horticulture. So many of these classical agronomic texts survive, but they weren't widely copied or circulated into the later Middle Ages. They were sometimes transmitted only through a sole copy. That I'm thinking of Varro and Columella, some of these really famous ones. what happened was, in late antiquity, in the 4th and the 5th centuries, writers often produced new texts, compiling and extracting earlier ones. And those are what circulated really widely in my period, in the early Middle Ages. So Rutilius Palladius, he wrote a compilation in the 4th century called De Re Rustica, which was snippets, extracts of Columella, of Gargilius Martialis. There was an epitome of Vitruvius that was all sort of reshuffled and repackaged into something organized by month, what you do in the garden each month. And that's how Latin agronomic texts circulated. Now, cultural attitudes to agriculture underwent 2 major transformations in late antiquity. I'm going to quickly cover them. They're not unidirectional, they're not unilateral, and they happen in different places and with different people differently. But I want to interrogate how the world of the mind played a role in reshaping the material and the practice of early medieval Italy. So it's not just war, and it's not just economic deprivation that prompted people to grow their own food, but also because of a different idea about self-sufficiency. So traditional ideas of self-sufficiency and the efficient management of states took on really new significance in religious houses, which took on the responsibilities of charitable feeding, as well as the support of a dedicated religious community. So there's a connection between gardens and the dedicated religious, and that's some of the very earliest and most influential thinking about Christian life. It starts in the Garden of Eden, where both flowers and fruits grew, and that was the site of man's fall. Augustine wrote his Confessions, let's just say circa 400, which reflects his own conversion to a dedicated religious ascetic life. That moment of conversion happens under a fig tree in the city of Milan, when he heard a voice coming from a neighboring garden. The Greek life of the 4th century Egyptian saint ascetic Pachomius describes his disciple, who started a monastic life in his own garden. His life was really influential among late Roman thinkers who were setting out new ways of living as ways in which men and women might reconcile the fall of man in Eden by setting themselves apart from the world in ascetic abstinence. The provision of food growing was a key part of that. So if in ancient literature, gardens and cultivated spaces were really valued as places of otium, of a particular kind of leisure, in late antique religious communities, they were definitely not. So the rule of Benedict is a really good example of this. Church fathers like Benedict and other leaders of religious communities, of ascetic communities, were averse to traditional forms of leisure of the Roman world. They didn't like games, they didn't like chariot races, they didn't like gardens, and they didn't like leisure. Benedict writes that leisure or idleness is the enemy of the soul. And among the guidance for early religious communities, there's a consistent intent to provide gardens for men and women who are living together for the purposes of devotion to God. There's clearly food-producing gardens in mind here. The rule of the master, which is an anonymous rule that was composed probably in Italy in the early 6th century, specified that all that was necessary must be contained within a monastery's walls, including an oven for bread and a garden. And Benedict's rule, of which I'm showing you a very early manuscript here, includes, it's chapter 66, that a monastery should, if possible, be so constructed that within it all necessities, such as water, mill, and garden, are contained, and the various crafts are practiced. Then there will be no need for monks to roam outside, because this is not at all good for their souls. We wish, sorry, that's a typo there, I apologize. We wish this rule to be read often in the community so that none of the brothers can offer the excuse of ignorance. Now, the rule of Benedict is based very much on the rule of the master. These are common with really quite a lot of early monastic rules. So a rural setting for religious communities is kind of implied in these, right? You're out in the countryside and you can lay out this monastery, but realistically, quite a lot of monasteries were like the one that Gregory described in his letter that was sitting in a townhouse in Rome. Now, In the period up to the 6th century, models of asceticism and communal living among the dedicated religious evolved new theologies and practices to resolve changing ideas and circumstances. And the teaching of agronomy informed decisions not only about monasteries, but also about households of other kinds of churchmen. So Benedict, Cassiodorus, Augustine, Gregory, and several others who composed rules or institutions for religious life and who took on leadership of the early church, lived their lives as aristocratic men of very high standing. They were well educated when they went into their religious lives. Augustine, Gregory, key examples of this. Their background and their social status provided them with a common knowledge, a paideia, which included the books and the poems and the images which esteemed agriculture and estate management. The discourse of how to manage an estate and a household proved, I think, directly influential, not only to monastic thinkers, but also to bishops who used that same kind of knowledge about estate management and translated it into the organization of church families. So economia was a specialized branch of practical knowledge and personal ethics in antiquity. Vitruvius, the architectural theoretician of the 1st century, gave 6 principles desirable in architectural design, one of which was economia, the efficient management of resources and site, and the frugal principled supervision of working expenses. That's a quote from Vitruvius. And so in late antiquity, because of the education of the men who's responsible for making building these new religious communities, certainly in the West, these ideas of economia fed into the practice of power and stewardship of ecclesiastical households. We looked at the case of Gregory the Great and his allocation of that patrician woman's home and the community of nuns there. And I think this is a good example, but just one example, of this new kind of ecclesiastical stewardship within the properties of the church. Now, I'm going to discuss 2 other ways in which gardens in households related to new ideas, and I'll do them really quickly, and I'll bring this to a close. In the examples I'm going to show you, we can see that houses with gardens were economically valuable, but they were also extremely valuable as social tools. So I'm going to give you 2 examples, both of which come from texts. One is from Naples. So this is another document, an original document that's preserved as a charter. It's actually no longer preserved because the Archivio di Stato of Naples was bombed in World War II. So all of the originals have disappeared, but we have a 19th century transcription by Capasso of these early medieval documents. So members of the Esauri family, who have neighboring properties, as we'll see, are Maru and her daughter Barberia. So Maru and Barberia, the nun, they are a mother and daughter. For the redemption of their souls, they give to their family's church, their own church of Santa Eufemia, which is located in the region of Duos Amantes, near the public wall, this is in Naples, an entire garden located in front of the church with trees, a pool, and all that pertains to it, which is adjacent on the eastern side of the garden of Dominus Anastasius the prefect, to the garden of Maria, sister and aunt of them, and on the other side to the west, a road which runs from the public wall up to the entrance to the church and to this garden, and the entrance to the garden of Johannes Esauri, and on the other southern end, adjacent to the garden of Johannes and Gregorius Esauri, and also the garden of Johannes, son of Stephanus the tribune. And on the other side to the north, the church and the garden of Johannes, son of Elias, now deceased. Likewise, we offer another garden, which is next to the communal pool and its entrance and all that pertains to it. It is held that in all the days of their lives, this mother and daughter have the usufruct of these things, and both or whichever of them survives likewise from that point should do or decide in her power. So they're giving a property to a monastery, to a church, which is a family church, but they're keeping the use of it. They're keeping the use of the garden until they die. And what's happening here is that the monastery is going to take responsibility for the land and let the women live there and use the garden for their own needs. It's a way of building in a relationship between the dedicated clerics and the community, which is going to outlive Maru and Barberia, but is going to allow them to live off the property. So it's a way of, it's a sort of social welfare gesture that people of a certain status are able to do. The monastery, as designated beneficiary, becomes engaged in preserving the property and in some ways protecting the current owners so that it retains its value. But the value is not just commercial. Its value lies in the vegetables that can be grown for the households who own it, who are first Maru and Barberia, and then the monks of the monastery. We can see other examples of this in Naples. Here I'm showing you a sort of reconstruction of the city of Naples in the early Middle Ages, and the Church of Santa Eufemia, which is located right here. And we've got areas of dark earth, which are located often quite close to these existing churches, which speak to other areas which are brought into cultivation in the early Middle Ages. And I'm going to close with this document, which is a whopper. It's a really big document that's in the British Library. This is a document from Berengar, who's the king and later tried to be the emperor of Italy. This is he had a very long life and reign from the sort of the 10th century, beginning of the 10th century. And you can see his wax seal there. And then actually his signature there as well. So the document reads, I've given you a translation of the relevant bits here. In the name of God Eternal, Berengar King, because Grimaldus, our glorious and delightful and faithful count, has petitioned, we grant a little land, which is located inside the arena, not far from the castle of Verona, with its present vaulted arches, and also the other vaulted arches and vaults within the land located in front of them, with the exception of the vaults which we previously gave to Atto of the castle, of which the total is 13. And this little land inside the designated place, in the length on one side 10 perches and on the other side 7 perches, and at one end 2 perches, and at the other side 6 feet. On the east and the north of the land are public and royal buildings, and on the west are properties of John the Chamberlain and other men, and in the south is a public road. We give it to John the cleric and our chamberlain to have, to hold, to sell, exchange, alienate, and what the soul might choose, do whatever he may wish to do without intervention from public powers. And if anyone should attempt to infringe or violate our authority in this concession, know that the fine is £100 for of the best gold, half paid to our chamber, half to John, to whomever he chooses, so that everyone can believe that it is correct and can diligently observe. We sign by our own hand and we order it to be sealed by the impression of our ring. And you saw that. So dated to 913. So this little land, terula, and terra, even in the diminutive, always refers to agricultural property. This little piece of land is located in the arena of Verona. Now, if you've been to opera in Verona, that's where that's normally known as the arena, the amphitheater. And we're not talking about that. We're talking about this area here, a theater of Verona, in the area that was the castle, right? The castrum here from the Ostrogothic period. And Berengar is giving away a number of parcels of property in the city of Verona, all of which have gardens attached to them. So here are the ones that he is giving. There are 2 that are located here in this fortified area of the castrum, and then there's one that's over here in the Corte Alta, which is another area of royal authority, of fiscal property that is owned by the crown. And he's doing this to his very faithful subordinates, his very trusted members of his household. And we know that John the Chamberlain hangs on to it, and then what he does is he converts it to what's called a xenodocium, that is a hostel for travelers and pilgrims. It's a specific kind of charitable institution of the early Middle Ages. And I think he's doing that because it's got a cultivated space attached to it. This kind of property with a garden attached to it becomes particularly useful for a certain kind of hospitality. But one of the things that's extremely, I think, relevant about that document is that this is a very high status document. It's huge, it's big, parchment's got a big seal. This is a royal donation, and it's very visible. So anyone in Verona would have said, oh, John Chamberlain, he's got a really nice garden there that's located in this very prestigious part of the city in the arena. And he describes the sort of little vaults of things that are surrounding it. And this kind of visibility, I think, is really important. I'm showing you here, I think, a very beautiful 19th century painting of the 19th century state of the theater of Verona. You can see the sort of back wall of the theater here. And the Xenotochium that John creates becomes, over the course of the later Middle Ages, this little church that's located here. And I want you to kind of get a sense of just how visible in the urban landscape these kinds of properties are. So let me conclude. I want to explain a little bit about what I think is at stake in considering urban food production in early medieval Italy. There is a grand narrative of the early medieval city, which runs something like this. The vibrant state encouraged or private enterprise motivated economy of the late Roman Empire diminishes with the eastward relocation of the imperial seat and the dissolution of imperial administration in the West. Plague and poverty and war reduced the urban populations of the 5th and 6th centuries to fractions of what they had been. And cities, the poor people who are still sitting in cities or living in cities, are forced to fend for themselves in this sort of decaying, mostly abandoned, clearly very muddy cities. The population uptick, the territorial reorganization around the end of Carolingian rule, of which Berengar is a part of this, and then eventually the rise of communes and the commercial revolution in the 11th century, permit the restoration of a clear divide between urban, mercantile civilization and rural village life and agriculture. As with all grand narratives, there are elements of this picture which are demonstrably correct. But what I'd like to point out tonight is the way in which this narrative demotes the development of urban gardening to a kind of subsistence level reflex, rather than a deliberate and organized shift in modes of production. And I think that these transformations are not simply a collapse into poverty and squalor. They're specific and deliberate shifts that are made according to and promoting new values and responding to new realities. We can then begin to see the way in which the urban landscapes of Italy changed. They became greener, just as the food in Italy became decidedly more local. The means by which people fed their families changed, so that the relationships between one's townhouse and one's relatives and one's access to cultivated spaces and fresh food changed. People's views on horticulture and households changed towards a world in which practical agricultural knowledge was transmitted, often within the context of religious scholarship, religious houses. And the nature of domestic space was no longer one in which leisure entailed dining on food that had been brought from the countryside, or admiring classical statuary or roses. People probably still enjoyed their dinners and they probably admired other things, but the structural apparatus for that kind of behavior no longer exists. Instead, cultural value and social value are found in having cultivated spaces and presumably in working them productively, in making them in connection to religious institutions or to royal households, and in making foods for the household and exchanging it between households. Productive spaces were tools for building social relationships on earth, of obligation and of prestige. And they were also key for storing up assets in heaven by putting those resources in the hands of religious communities. So through the transformations of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, urban living took on new forms, and urban horticulture is, I think, a key part of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. So much to take in. But I think, I mean, I feel that I understand now that it is I think I'm getting this right, that it can be viewed, this change in urban gardening, as purposeful and mindful, not to use jargon, but rather than just a kind of a desperate reaction. And it was interesting to me that you said that the optimists tend to be text-based.
Yeah.
What could you elaborate on that for a second?
I think it has a lot to do with the kind of intellectual habits of the disciplines of history versus the intellectual habits of the disciplines of archaeology.
Mm.
In that people who are working on documents, like that one from Berengar, or like the one from Barbaria and Maru in Naples, tend to see them as kind of progressive moves, right? That the document represents a social bond, and that it represents a kind of the emerging new opportunities for social maneuver within, in this case, within cities, but across the board. And they, because they're looking at texts, they can kind of use their active imagination, and they're not confronted by the reality of crumbling buildings or of
Weather.
latrines in proximity to the entrance to your house. And archaeologists, certainly archaeologists who are trained in Italy, are much more pessimistic about these kinds of transformations, because they are habituated to finding like a mosaic floor. You know, at the bottom of everything is this really nice Roman paved floor with a mosaic on it if you're lucky, or painted walls, or that kind of thing. That's what people are brought up on, archaeologically speaking, and that's not the reality of an early medieval house by any stretch of the imagination. So the kind of brutal reality of living in early medieval Italy is more apparent to archaeologists, but archaeologists are also more, as I say, habituated to thinking in terms of everything is, you know, Roman is the paradigm, and everything else kind of that's not Roman is somehow weaker.
Mm. Interesting. The brutal reality, I think, in part does that. You can imagine the kind of smooth jumping between texts and periods, which we've all done, and I do, and then actually being, you know, basically on the ground. I hope this doesn't sound flip, but one thing I found so interesting, my brain just went boom, talking about Naples, and was it Maru? Or Maru, and that kind of arrangement about the house and the garden, and still giving it over, but still being able to use the garden. And I immediately thought of National Trust houses and gardens in England, where, you know, sometimes you hear the family is still in the East Wing, but the rest of the house is open to the public, and the family use the garden at night. And it just was interesting to me that that is a persistent model that works for, is it a type of philanthropy or a bit of social positioning or charitable giving, whatever title you put on it. I didn't realize how far back that went. So that was really very interesting.
Yeah, it's exactly that sort of thing, except I think if you give your grand house to the National Trust, you've got a team of gardeners who are working the garden for you. You're probably not doing it yourself, whereas I suspect that Maru and Barbaria are doing the gardening themselves for their little vegetable patch.
But they're still keeping their treasure.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So that was very interesting. I'm just going to say to the cohort and whomever is still out there, if there are any questions, please pop them into the chat box. Also to say, Caroline, that Margaret Goring said to you, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. So I didn't want to miss saying that to you. No, I thought it was fascinating. One thing that you probably can't answer easily, or is probably a little bit, it's too big a question, but I'm not quite clear how we go from admiring people with agricultural husbandry skills and a knowledge of plants and gardens, and then, you know, i.e. Rome, and then you jump to this idea, you were talking about the popes, I suppose, particularly saying not so good, and then we get to Florence, let's say, you know, 15th century, and otium,
Yeah,
which is a great and wonderful thing.
yeah.
Is that just change the changing prism?
Well, so there are a lot of changes which account for that, I think. One thing that's interesting in my work, or that's interesting to me, is to think about how it's kind of easy to imagine Christianity as a fairly monolithic thing, at least until you get to the Reformation. Whereas in fact, it's not. It evolves over time, and one of the ways in which early Christian men, early Christian male writers and theologians differentiated themselves from Roman philosophers of the same period, right? Because they're coexisting through the 4th century, is to say, we don't do these sorts of things. We don't give perfume and food to the dead. We don't wear crowns. We don't like horse racing and that kind of spectacle. These are the things that we do, and so kind of very mundane things were used to differentiate them. I mean, according to Christian doctrine, there's quite a lot of other things that differentiated a traditional Roman pagan philosopher and a Christian theologian, right? A belief in a different god, even, and a prohibition on other gods. But there's quite a lot of kind of practical, everyday things which were used as tools to differentiate those communities, which then just, by the time you get to the 7th century, nobody even remembers what those pagan philosophers were or how influential they might have been. At which point other ideas emerge about extreme asceticism or about food asceticism. So people rejecting food is something that comes in, particularly in the 12th century, as a sort of marker of extreme asceticism. And then once you get to 15th century Florence, the interest in otium is a very deliberate revival or reconstruction of ancient forms of pre-Christian living in that highly antiquarian context.
And of course, fairly text-based, yes. Okay, so thank you very much. That I'm going to think about that tonight. A question which we've just touched on Florence, and Catherine Hunter has asked, have you looked at any other cities such as Florence? For instance,
I have. Yeah, I have. So Florence, before the 13th century, is not a very large city, but it certainly it fits very much the same kind of patterns as Verona, as Piacenza. Pavia was a royal city, so it was rather more grand. But we know a lot about Florence from the, let's say, not so much the archaeobotanical perspective, but from the soils perspective, because of the parking, the car park of the Uffizi Gallery was excavated in the late 90s, and a number of archaeologists got really interested in looking at soil stratification there to try and understand the formation of dark earths there. And so there's been a lot of really wonderful work on micromorphological analysis of what the sort of soil actually was made up of. And in that case, it was quite a lot of animal manure and human night soil that was sort of chucked into ash pits, and then a series of sort of floods of the Arno that really kind of reconfigured the fabric of the city of Florence in that period. And within that, we get a certain amount of the preservation of archaeobotanical remains, because they're in a waterlogged context next to the Arno. We don't have the documents from Florence. There are often accidents of preservation about where we can get the documents. So I tend to look at places where we can put them together. We can put the archaeology with the texts. And Florence is not one of those places. But we certainly do know about the shape of Florence in this period through archaeology. Yeah.
Fascinating. Pippa has asked, what sense do you get that urban gardeners traded and or used produce as tokens of prestige?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Well, I know that they're trading household gardening products because we can sometimes see it. They're paying rent in kind often, and so they will have to pay a certain quantity of beans or a certain
Mm.
quantity of greens or a certain quantity of gourds are part of their payment. They're recorded as things that people are paying. Um, there are symbolic gifts, usually to a priest or to a church, and they tend to be less horticultural and more animal. So priests often get eggs as a sort of annual donation, or they'll get a pork shoulder as part of their, and it's a speculum porci, and it's really quite explicitly not any part of the pig, but definitely the shoulder, as part of their kind of annual. It's not really a tithe in this period, but it's a kind of annual compulsory payment to the local
Mm.
church will
Mm.
happen in terms of agricultural produce rather than in terms of money. And it's worth pointing out, I didn't really mention this, but surprisingly enough, there's very little actual coin that's being used in this
Mm.
period. They have the concept of coins, they use the terms for coins in their documents, but they're not actually using coins an awful lot. I mean, we don't use coins an awful lot now. We've all got our cards
Mm.
and our phones, and we do all of this sort of contactless payment. So we're similar in that regard, but they don't have cards or phones. They're transacting in coins, but they're using equivalencies in household products.
Eggs and pork. Yeah.
Eggs and pork. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
absolutely. And here in medieval England, at Christmas, tenants gave flour and, that of course. Really interesting question. Eden asks, thank you, this was fascinating. The phrase, the Garden of Anna, most noble girl, caught my attention. Am I interpreting correctly that the property was owned by a single female, which I would not necessarily have expected in that time frame?
Yes, you've got that right. That's how I interpret that as well. So one of the things that I find really interesting about Italy up and down the peninsula in this period is that there are very different. There are different cultures, as it were. So there's Byzantine Italy in the south, and there's Lombard Italy in the north, and Rome itself has a very I mean, it's notionally Byzantine, but it's quite autonomous by the time we get to the 10th century. And in Rome, women definitely, in Rome and the territories around Rome, women can definitely own property. Only really widows I don't want to exaggerate the thing too much, but we don't see that so often in Lombard parts of Italy. But certainly in the area around Rome, women are proprietors. Noble Girl is quite interesting because she's not a widow at all. But she only appears as a neighbor. We don't really know much about her, and there's no other documents in which she comes up or that I can identify her in this kind of cluster of rental agreements with the church. But yes, these documents are, I mean, I just think they're fascinatingly filled with little details like that, where sometimes you just get a little note about the kind of relationship between people, or their physical features. Sometimes their people are described as being tall or something, or they have little nicknames in them, and so you get a real sense of kind of neighborhood societies and kind of interaction between people in these cities through the documents. But they're very tantalizing. We can rarely sort of interrogate them too closely.
No, but it's a fascinating phrase. It would make a really good title of a book or something. Most Noble Girl, Anna, Most Noble Girl. Yes, tantalizing. Max has asked, have you investigated the continuity in certain sites of cultivation within urban environments from the Middle Ages to today? An example that comes to mind is the island of Sant'Erasmo in Venice, or the Horti at the Giudecca, that were once looked after by nuns and today by the female inmates of the penitentiary in Venice. But there are many other such examples that could be, brought to the conversation.
That's entirely correct. I mean, there are other examples like the gardens of the Palatine in Rome, which go from being imperial property to then being monastic property to then being the Farnese family's property, and the Horti Farnesini in the early modern period. Venice, it sounds like it doesn't really exist. I mean, it's sort of founded in, I don't know, late 8th, early 9th centuries. There's not much of it there. People are on the terraferma before then. But and cultivation and food resources for Venice are really, really interesting and problematic for reasons that are self-evident. There are lots of places which do seem to have this real continuity of use for cultivation. One of the things that probably everyone here knows is just how difficult the archaeology of gardens is, in part because of the continual turnover of soil, right? If you're continually gardening, you're moving soil around quite a lot. So you don't get that sort of stratigraphic sequence that goes down with time. You only get that when a volcano erupts and covers everything over, or when people knock down bits of buildings and then build another building right on top of it that seals everything. So from archaeological contexts, they're really, really quite difficult. But we certainly do know of some of them. Yeah.
There's also cases, for instance, here in England where, between the 18th and 19th century, sometimes the garden was raised. Domestic back garden was raised with soil, and so traps the earlier garden underneath. But yes, it's extremely difficult. Judith Rossiter says, thank you very much. It's amusing that the legalese for property exchange doesn't seem to have changed much over the centuries.
No, we're still indebted to quite a lot of those phrases that Roman jurists gave us. Yeah.
And also some of the practices, kind of human instinctive practices that you are outlining, sort of they change, but a lot of it was new because, for instance, I hadn't thought of some of that urban gardening in the way that you're now looking at it. So I had to readjust a little bit. It's not my field at all, but some of the human instincts are similar. So it's fascinating field. Well, Caroline, thank you so much.